Good afternoon, honorable members. When the business of the House suspended, the honorable member for Marco City had reserved the floor. But just before we proceed, honorable member, the chair wishes to recognize the presence of a class from the University of the Bahamas, the journalism class. I'm headed by Miss, I hope I pronounce this right, Paula Alvino. You can please stand for me. I also like to recognize that in this grouping is the daughter of the member for South and Central Andrews. Miss Priscilla Forbes, who is following in her father's footsteps. She'll become the hometown girl. Thank you very much for your attendance, and we trust that you enjoy the presentations by honorable members this evening. Thank you. The chair recognizes the honorable member for Marco City.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Let me first give special thanks to the residents of Marco City who have given me this opportunity to come here and speak on their behalf, to share their vision, their aspirations for transforming their community and ultimately the Bahamas, and who give me an opportunity on a daily basis to work on their behalf. I wish to salute the team in Marco City who, in my absence, being in Nassau on a regular basis, continue to work diligently to alleviate much of the suffering that our people continue to endure in Grand Bahama. I also wish to give special condolences to the family of Yvette Evans, who tragically passed recently. She's also a resident of Marco City, and Miss Tashana Knowles, her family, and of course, a powerful woman in Grand Bahama, Miss Queenie Hanna, who just recently passed. I want all of the families to know that you are in our prayers, and as much as we love you, we recognize that what we are able to do for you in this time of bereavement is limited, but God has the power and the capacity to provide comfort and the peace that passeth all understanding. Amen. I also wish to give condolences to the family of Calvin Johnson, a Bahamian who, back in the day when he challenged the sitting member of Parliament in what came to be known as Centerville, he was fearless, he was dynamic, he had an incredible team. It is a great loss for the Bahamas in the passing of Calvin Johnson. Mr. Speaker, legislation is extremely important in giving the public an indication of the government's priorities as well as the mindset of the leadership. The Bahamian people made a decision to give the Free National Movement a mandate just recently, less than 6 months ago. And they did not only give us a mandate, Mr. Speaker, they also gave us a rare opportunity that men and women who serve a country have, and that is to take the skill set, to take the temperament, to take the passion that public may have grown to admire during an election season, and to give us an opportunity to fulfill the promises we made to them. And also, they gave us an opportunity to implement initiatives, some of which we hadn't even discussed on the campaign trail. It is a rare opportunity to shape the direction of a country. And no one with whom I work now, Mr. Speaker, takes this responsibility lightly. whether they are with portfolio or without portfolio. It is an honor to work with the men and women in the Free National Movement that I have the pleasure of serving with at this time. What makes this group, Mr. Speaker, fairly unique is that the majority of the members on this side, while they would welcome an opportunity to serve a second term, political considerations that would guarantee the second term is not what is in the forefront of our minds. We would love for the Bahamian people to give us a second chance, but we committed not to spend our time with optics, low-hanging fruits, and statements that lead towards that. We thought we'd spend our time trying to do the work that will change people's lives. And if we produce results that make the public's burden lighter, that change the trajectory of the country, and the voting population then decides they'd give us another chance, we'd be grateful. But we are here to serve you. And the priority in rendering this service is transforming a country that we know is challenged, a government system that in some places are broken, in other places it is ineffective. So, Mr. Speaker, we thank the population, but we wish to assure them that we're not about optics, we're not about PR, we're about HR, changing the human resources in this country and the condition of our people. Mr. Speaker, we have heard one of the plays out of the opposition's playbook, which is to paint the story that we lack a plan and that much of the brokenness in our country, which they have played a key role in creating, that we just need to forget the past as a government, not remind the people of the poor stewardship of the opposition, and we should just get on with the business and fix it. Mr. Speaker, we accept fully our responsibility to govern in an effective way despite meeting a damaged and broken system and a public treasury that had been savaged by inappropriate and poor decisions of our predecessors. Having said all of that, we accept our responsibility to be a part of the solution, a part of fixing this country. Our mission, Mr. Speaker, is fourfold. One, every government ought to be in the business of either introducing new legislation that makes a difference or tweaking existing legislation. Two, we should be in the business of either introducing new policies that will change the condition of our people or tweaking it. Or we should be in a position, thirdly, to introduce programs, ongoing initiatives that remedy a particular challenge we have or help us seize an opportunity that's out there. And finally, the role of government is to introduce projects, one-off, two-off initiatives that can make a difference in our people's lives. This piece of legislation is a part of that fourfold mission, ministry, that we understand clearly and we take responsibility for. And so the case I intend to make, Mr. Speaker, in a very short period of time, is to show how, one, this piece of legislation seeks to solve very specific challenges we face as a country, and two, to make the point that this shows the kind of administration being led by Prime Minister Minnis that we have. In other words, this piece of legislation gives the public a clear view of what our mindset is and what they can expect over the course of the next 5 years. Mr. Speaker, the first and very significant point that this piece of legislation makes is that the Bahamas is a country that is governed by laws. Over the last 5 years, Mr. Speaker, it has not been uncommon for a minister to attempt to speak law into existence or to elevate policy in his mind to the level of law. And it is a dangerous way to govern. What we are doing in this piece of legislation is seeking to eliminate much of the subjectivity, the bias, and even unethical practices of public officials by removing, to a large extent, Mr. Speaker, the predisposition that some politicians have to favor friends and family and that third dreaded category. Mr. Speaker, this is a country of laws. And the truth is, Mr. Speaker, that sometimes seated in cabinet, you might be tempted to give the colleague who sits next to you a pass, even if the decision that they are making is unethical or illegal. We've had several instances over the last 5 years that brought this point home. We've heard much in this debate about the nollies that have been issued under dubious circumstances. We are also familiar, Mr. Speaker, with the case where a sitting minister interfered with the judiciary as a public servant sat as a magistrate. And so, Mr. Speaker, the first thing that this piece of legislation seeks to accomplish is to remind the public in general, but more importantly, remind lawmakers that this is a country of laws, and no matter how special we think we are, we have to be governed by something just a little bit bigger than us in this place, which is the law of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. The second thing, Mr. Speaker, that this piece of legislation seeks to accomplish is it seeks to restore confidence in this jurisdiction. Our predecessors made several decisions that sent shocking messages in the international community and brought our jurisdiction into a state of disrepute. One of them, Mr. Speaker, was their participation in the Bahama debacle that gave the impression that the government was participating in a hostile takeover. Mr. Speaker, equally, if not more damning to this country's reputation, is to leave a perception in the minds of the local and international public that the politician reach is so far that they have the ability in a very perverse way to reach into the judiciary and influence final decisions. This piece of legislation seeks to remove some of the decisions that a politician will naturally be inclined to make, either to initiate or not initiate a case, or to issue a nollie. It would remove that from their purview by and large and put it in the hands of a director of public prosecutions who's more than capable of making sensible decisions. And so, Mr. Speaker, the second major objective of this piece of legislation, and the picture it paints of the Minnis administration, is that the Bahamas is a country where there is a separation of powers, and persons who wish to invest here could be assured on the commercial side of the court that politicians do not dictate outcomes. On the criminal side of the court, politicians do not dictate outcomes, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the third thing that this legislation seeks to accomplish is to demonstrate how responsive we are as a government. We have seen over the last 5 years where a number of critical promises have been made by our predecessors which they have not honored. It is important, Mr. Speaker, if the public, who I might add, happen to be very cynical about politicians and the things that we say, if the public is to have confidence in public figures, they must be able to at least trust our words. And if we act or if we make a statement in error, that we are quick to remedy it and to demonstrate that we've changed. Because I think repentance is not only about admitting wrongdoing, but willing not to repeat it again. The Progressive Liberal Party, as you've seen in the most recent convention, they habitually apologize for sins they intend to commit in the future. Mr. Speaker, we are, Mr. Speaker, we are responsive. We are, I'm sorry, I passed it already. Mr. Speaker, we are responsive. Mr. Speaker, the Constitutional Commission called for the piece of legislation that we are introducing. The outrage expressed in those cases where the former government violated the trust of the people by clearly seeking to blur the lines of separation of powers, this administration is responding to the outcry of the public and bringing a relevant piece of legislation that corrects those offenses. So I find it rather disconcerting and rather childish when any politician on any side of the political divide makes a recommendation, and if it even appears as if the governing side accepts the recommendation, they start throwing remarks about how, you know, it was really us who suggested that. The reality is governments ought to be responsive. So if there's a criticism raised by the opposition, we have a moral obligation on behalf of the people to take that criticism on, pivot and make the necessary adjustments so that the people that we serve, their issues are solved. This administration is responsive. I remind the public, the points that I make is simply to give an indication that even in this legislation, you will get a glimpse of what you could expect from a minister-led administration. We believe in a country of laws. We wish to restore the reputation of this country, and we are responsive to the voice of our people. Fourthly, Mr. Speaker, you would have heard from a number of my colleagues that a part of our mission, so when they ask the question, what is your plan for governance? Well, the plan is to validate every single Bahamian, to say no matter if you're living through Step Street in Fox Hill, or Melbourne Road in Yellow Elder, or New Bight in Cat Island, or Tasman Close in Marco City, or in Pine Ridge, or if you're living in Inagua or Marsh Harbor, Abaco, all of us are equal, and we are entitled to equality under the law. So essentially, one of the things that this administration is saying by bringing this bill, which is to take power out of the hands of politicians who are often driven by ego, who often are not interested in devolving power, or our predisposition is to keep control of most dimensions of decision making. We are sending a clear signal here on at least two levels. One is we're saying every Bahamian is equal, and that the person who is wealthy ought to be treated under the law in much the same way as the person who is challenged financially. That's one of the points that we're making. And so a director of public prosecution is at liberty to bring charges against the moneyed, the degreed, and the so-called petty greed. They are also, in my view, Mr. Speaker, that this piece of legislation is also making another point, and that is brilliance does not only reside in the Parliament of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas, but there are Bahamians throughout the length and breadth of this country who are equal and oftentimes more brilliant than the public servants that they elect.
Very good.
So by vesting authority in the director of public prosecutions, in essence, Dr. Minnis and this team is making this point. And it is a point that is firmly rooted in F&M tradition. And that is, we believe that we should give power to the people. That's why we've established the many authorities throughout this country, to give private citizens an opportunity to serve this country in very influential ways, to shape the direction of a number of important national developments, in conjunction with politicians, but certainly canvassing the public to get the best possible views from members of the general public. So the Director of Public Prosecution is talented, is gifted, and we ought to have confidence as a political directorate that someone other than a minister has the ability to make sensible pronouncements and decisions about the future of this country. The act of being elected or appointed does not suddenly transform any of us into geniuses. And we understand that in the Free National Movement. The fifth item we attempt to accomplish in this legislation is that we are seeking to reduce the options available to politicians to engage in corrupt practices, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this real talk. Human beings, being who we are less inclined to take action against someone who's in cabinet with us on an ongoing basis, even if the act is deeply egregious, unethical, and even illegal. And while we know that in this administration, the bar has been set high, the line has been drawn in the sand, it is in the realm of possibility that the side opposite, if they do not change, could return to power with the same culture they were booted out of office with and continue the same practices. So we're seeking to guard against any excesses, any poor decisions that will unlikely arise in this administration, but will most likely arise in a PLP administration if they are returned to power. We seek to put a check on that power. Mr. Speaker, the sixth objective that this act, this bill, is seeking to remedy or to achieve is that we want to send a clear message that in the Bahamas under this administration, it is not business as usual.
No.
So, Mr. Speaker, when the side opposite begins or continues to craft its message of subversion or to undermine this administration is a better phrase I would use. What we are saying, in essence, Mr. Speaker, is that having come in on the heels of a litany of horrendous decisions by the former administration, we had an obligation to send a message to the public that we will behave differently. And so this piece of legislation is but one of many parts that we intend to introduce to show that we intend to function different than they. In other words, Mr. Speaker, it is only paying lip service when you talk about a Freedom of Information Act and don't deliver it. When you talk about the independence of the judiciary, but you don't respect it. When you wish to put colleagues on notice that they will be treated in a similar manner as Joe Public if they do something wrong, and you don't do it. This piece of legislation signals to the public the Free National Movement is fundamentally different than the side opposite. Mr. Speaker, the seventh thing that we are hoping to accomplish, and Mr. Speaker, this is an important one, is that we believe in transparency. And so you would have heard my colleagues talk a lot about the Attorney General, when giving a directive to the Director of Public Prosecution, having to put it in writing and gazetting it. It's important that people are able to see what is motivating our decisions behind the scene. And what I find liberating being a part of this administration is that it's made clear to all colleagues, everyone here, absolutely clear, everyone, that if you make decisions in private that are unethical, illegal, at some point they will see the light of day. And so this piece of legislation is sending that message quite clearly, that if an AG, an Attorney General, is minded for some subjective or self-serving reason to make a decision, he or she is now constrained by the fact that whatever their motivation is, they have to now justify it in the court of public opinion by writing it down, and sensible, well-thinking Bahamians will have an opportunity to evaluate it. This administration, Mr. Speaker, is committed to transparency. And so what the public should be able to expect from us, that prior to the end of the year, the Freedom of Information Act will be introduced. Other pieces of legislation will be brought to this place that reinforce this point, that we are absolutely committed to transparency. And so, Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to be a part of this administration in that regard. And then finally, Mr. Speaker, the ninth point that this piece of legislation makes, and I believe it is the most important, we are seeking in doing this, as a part of a series of things that will be done similar to this, we are seeking to create in the Bahamas a new political culture. The Progressive Liberal Party, Mr. Speaker, I recall before the election before last, a number of very talented Bahamians were elected. And I remember being appointed to the Senate, and in the back of my mind, I entertained the idea for a second. I said, you know, we could be in opposition for a very long time, because when I looked at the men and women who had been elected, there were so many talented young men and women in the Progressive Liberal Party. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, something happened. And I think this is a word to our colleague from Exuma. And it's a message to all of us. Even when the PLP had the right message, with all the talent available, they seem to have found the wrong messenger. Even when the Progressive Liberal Party had available to it the right initiatives, like the Violence Breakers program, they lacked the moral authority to discontinue the violence at the street level only because the daddy and the godfathers of the street happened to have been in their ranks. Mr. Speaker, the point I'm making is this, and this is the final point, that what I believe the minister-led administration will bring to governance that will fundamentally change things is that we are seeking to create a new culture in Bahamian politics. Because it's not about being brilliant. There are many brilliant Bahamians who are absolutely corrupt. There are many Bahamians who are talented, but are using the talent for the wrong reason. So Mr. Speaker, at the core of this piece of legislation, and at the core of the decisions that we are making, at the core of the things we are deliberating on your behalf in private, is our desire to change the culture. When we say level playing field, that's a tsunami shift in the Bahamas, because you know the money, the greed, and the petty greed are those who are advantaged. So we're saying we want to level the playing field. We want things to be done in the open, or we want to send a message to people who are contemplating in private that at some point what you think in privately and deciding on will be known publicly. So I've given 8 reasons why we believe we are changing the culture. But let me bring it home this way, Mr. Speaker. The former administration did not have a fundamental problem in philosophy, did not have a fundamental problem in talent. The fundamental problem was that there was a culture that refused to embrace the change the young talent that came into the PLP brought. So the young talent was either marginalized or cannibalized.
Edmund Moxie.
Several of them joined the Free National Movement. Others joined other organizations. And Mr. Speaker, a number of them left frontline politics. Mr. Speaker, there's a need for us to change the culture. And let me bring it home this way. You know the Progressive Liberal Party had an issue of culture. When it was possible that a minister could interfere with a sitting magistrate and an attorney general had an opportunity to correct the breach but refused to do so. That's a cultural problem. Secondly, when a court can rule that a private citizen, a financial backer of the Progressive Liberal Party, had no right to continue dredging. And yet, a permit could have been given. Consideration in other ways was given that flew in the face of a court order, then that is a cultural problem. So what we are seeking to do is to change the culture in the Bahamas, in the governance, and by extension, the way we as a people function. It is a cultural problem, Mr. Speaker. It's a cultural problem when you can have a minister of the government, multiple ministers of the government, on more than one occasion, criticizing a judge because the decision made by the judge flew in the face of the desire of the government. To the extent, Mr. Speaker, that they were prepared to do it openly and on more than one occasion. It becomes very difficult for international investors, for Bahamians to respect the independence of the judiciary when they see that there is no repercussion for a sitting minister who is brazen enough to question the decision of the court in a manner that is disrespectful. It is not to say that we do not take issue with a decision that a judge makes. That's why governments appeal decisions. But it is a problem when you begin to impute to a judge motives for making a decision that in law appears to be sound and has been reinforced by a court of appeal and up all the way up to the Privy Council. And so, Mr. Speaker, our goal is to change the culture, because nothing short of a fundamental cultural shift in the Bahamas is required in order for us to change the economy, in order for us to deal with the issue of violence in our community, in order for us to deal with the issue of immigration with honesty, humanity, but yet with forthrightness. There is a need for a cultural shift. And what I see in the deliberations of this administration, evidenced by this particular bill, is we are on a mission to change the culture in the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. Mr. Speaker, as I wrap up, I simply want to make one final point, Mr. Speaker, that all of us have an obligation to improve this country. And because we all have an obligation, Mr. Speaker, we ought to be honest when we come in this place and participate in these debates. And so, Mr. Speaker, I've tried over the last 6 months to steer clear of getting involved in deeply partisan discussions on whether it's legislation, policy, etc. We have way too much work to do. We have to put our head down. We have to get the work done. That's what we've been elected to do. But, Mr. Speaker, because people's minds, our memories are often short, it is important on occasion to remind the public, and more importantly in this case, to remind members opposite of how they have behaved when they were in charge. I have a simple rule in my life, Mr. Speaker, and I'm a very imperfect person, that if I'm challenged with a sin, it is unlikely that I'm going to mount somebody's pulpit to give a sermon during that period where I'm battling with that sin. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, when I choose the area that I will offer service in, I will avoid the area where the challenges are located. Members opposite clearly have adopted a different worldview in how they function. Because having failed to transform the culture in this country, they are now engaged in a campaign of being quite destructive in their analysis of everything that we do. Even the dance of a prime minister with his wife is now fodder for discussion. Mr. Speaker, let me bring it home and take my seat.
Bring it on. My God.
Today we are grappling with an issue of violence in this country. It is no secret that the side opposite have enjoyed a very intimate relationship with many of the most influential persons at the street level. We have an obligation, Mr. Speaker, whenever we form these relationships, we form them with a view of changing people's lives, not to facilitate them in staying in the same business. And so when I listen to some members of the side opposite talk about the minister with responsibility for national security and all that he ought to do, they ought to be honest and upfront and point out that they themselves are major contributors to the challenges we now face. Because when given an opportunity to speak life into those young men's lives, they refuse to do so. In fact, they have gone further in facilitating their continuation in that lifestyle by empowering them with multiple contracts. And they continued to have their informal sector income as well as official income from the Commonwealth of the Bahamas, lest we forget. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, we've had a challenge recently in this country, Mr. Speaker. I'm sorry. Oh, okay. Good.
Me? Man, I ain't that.
Okay. Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today this country needs a number of important solutions. Many of them require, Mr. Speaker, a tremendous amount of finance in order to introduce. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, the side opposite, while in government, made a number of financial decisions that have now put the Bahamas in a very precarious position. So, Mr. Speaker, let me just speak on one of them. $150 million was borrowed for hurricane relief. The Deputy Prime Minister made the point that finance has been able to identify 108 million of it. Let me make it clear, because already the Progressive Liberal Party is spinning the story. The $108 million being identified does not mean that we are in agreement that it has been spent honestly and ethically. The $108 million borrowed for hurricane relief, because we can account for where the funds are, does not mean we are in agreement that it was used for the intended purpose. And so throughout the Commonwealth of the Bahamas, Mr. Speaker, there are Bahamians whose homes were damaged by hurricane, who received no relief, even though millions of dollars were pumped into their community, but not into their lives.
Wow.
And so we are seeking to change the culture. Mr. Speaker, let me help out. Let me be very specific, since people want to grumble in their seat. Mr. Speaker, you have someone being elected who hopes to lead a country. The best way to judge the potential effectiveness of a future leader is to look at their track record. The island of Kid Island, Rumkey and San Salvador remains destituted under the leadership of the new leader of the Progressive Liberal Party. So as he casts aspersions from his seat, I only make the point. The best way to examine the potential of a leader is to examine their track record. Kid Island, $13 million to put potable water from north to south, probably even less. And in 20 years, no potable water. Rumkey, same thing. Economies that are destituted. So if you hope to lead the country in the future, demonstrate in the small islands with small population that transformation is possible. But Mr. Speaker, all of us have our files, Mr. Speaker, and 5 years is a long time to unpack them. And so that goes in all directions. So, Mr. Speaker, I just close by saying we are up to the task. We've clearly articulated a vision. We clearly have a plan. This piece of legislation ties into it, and Marco City supports this piece of legislation.
The chair recognizes the honorable member for Cat Island, Rumpke, and San Salvador.
My name was called, and it was not called in a. He called my Cat Island, Rumkins, and Salvador, and he spoke about being elected leader. I was the only one who's just been elected leader. I represent Cat Island and Salvador. And all I want to say, Mr. Speaker, what I say is, I don't want, Mr. Speaker, I said before in this House that I stand on my record, my track record. I stand on what I have done for many, many young persons in this country. Remember from Bamboo Town to the test, to the work we did together in addressing the issue. I could also, no, he abandoned me after a while. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, the very case he makes about my track record in Cat Island, Rumkins, and Salvador, he made that case to the very people who ought to have known and who ought to have taken note. And they rejected his arguments then, and will be rejected again. They rejected it then, they rejected it again. So those persons who know what I would have done in Cat Island, Rumkins, and Salvador, right? And since he's speaking of potable water, I just wish your government will continue the program for the potable water that has been started in there, and I just trust they do. And I say one final word. I say, Bella nec provocandum nec temendium. I don't pick no fight with no one. I pick no fight with no one, but I fear not. I've left that young man alone when he came here. I say no more.
The chair recognizes the honorable member for Marco City.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, I interpret that really as a threat. So Mr. Speaker, let me just say to the member by way of you, Mr. Speaker, for Cat Island, Rumkey, and San Salvador, who have, the unfortunate fortune to have him as their representative. Let me say, Mr. Speaker, that many attacks have come. There are some of us, Mr. Speaker, that when we speak about you, we are brave enough to stand up and look you in your eyes and say it. And then there are others who, by way of multiple emissaries, continue to launch attacks. So there's nothing that I would have said here today that can spur new events. These are ongoing events the member has participated in for years. And through the grace of God, I will meet every one of them.
As many?
Yeah, I see.
Okay. The chair recognizes the member that will bring some peace this afternoon, the honorable member for St. Barnabas.
I will try, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I always believe is important and necessary, let me give thanks to Almighty God again for giving me the breath and the opportunity to stand here to represent the great people of the great constituency of St. Barnabas, namely those residents in Coconut Grove, Big Pond, Black Village, Rock Crusher, and the Oaksfield area, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, before I get into the meat of my contribution, if you will, I just would like to make a few comments about three matters. The Bahamas Public Parks and Public Beaches Authority, which I am honored to serve as its executive chairman. Gratitude to the honorable member for Kalani for his confidence, has been engaged in a massive exercise to clean up our verges, our beaches, our parks, and our open spaces. And the staff and personnel of the Bahamas Public Parks and Public Beaches Authority is working diligently every day as we plan strategies to ensure the proper manicuring of the island of New Providence. But Mr. Speaker, there is something that continues to disturb me and should disturb all Bahamians. Again, the amount of indiscriminate dumping and littering across the island must stop. We clean a road or a verge today, even the airport road, and literally that night, litter is all over the place. Where's our sense of pride, Mr. Speaker? Where's our sense of pride? Where is our sense of love for country, Mr. Speaker? And amazingly, Mr. Speaker, and I've heard this discussion a lot, over the years. We hop on a plane and we go on I-95. We don't think about throwing something out of the window. There must be more of a sense of pride in our country. So I call upon all residents to hold each other into account. It must stop. It must stop, Mr. Speaker. I agree, honorable member, use the cell phones. Also, Mr. Speaker, I was privileged this week to be present at the handing over ceremony for the Commissioner of Police. And as I sat there, Mr. Speaker, and witnessed the seamless transition from one commissioner to the next, it just reaffirmed in my mind how important transition and visible transition is, because it's not about the person who serves in that office, it's about the office and the organization. And I sat there and I thought, wouldn't it be a glorious day when we can see maybe not something similar, but some sort of ceremony when you have transitions from one prime minister to the next. Now, Mr. Speaker, I will say I don't want that to happen too soon, any transition from the honorable member. But I'm just making the larger point that I think it will do well for unifying the country after an election, even though we've had pretty much non-violent elections. I spoke my mind. Yes. Yes, and I think that it's important, because it's about the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. And thirdly, Mr. Speaker, I know this morning the honorable member for Marathon mentioned it. Calvin Johnson, the former member of Parliament for Fort Fincastle, passed, and I would like to extend my personal condolences to his family. I knew him personally. He and I share a membership in an historic organization that was founded in 1906 called the Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. And so my prayers are with his family, and I pray that his soul rest in peace, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I rise to give support to this bill, I wish to preface my direct opinion on its substance and impact by momentarily reflecting on this moment as an exercise on leadership, good governance, and political will. We have been sent here to do a job for the Bahamian people. And for me personally, Mr. Speaker, it is days like this that soothes my conscience, because we are working and ensuring that things get done in this honorable house. Mr. Speaker, in my adolescent years, like so many others, I didn't know much about anything. However, Mr. Speaker, even in those early years, in God's infinite wisdom, He placed in my consciousness a stubborn and unrelenting awareness of some core principles, which, if you had asked me at that tender age to articulate exactly what they were, I would have fallen short in my attempt. Mr. Speaker, all I knew is, and what I felt then, and still feel, but now with good parenting, a good education, consistent mentorship, and life's experience, I can fully express today as core convictions that has led me to serve the people of St. Barnabas and our great country in this honorable place. Mr. Speaker, I knew at an early age that God had a purpose for my life, and that I must spend every waking moment trying to fulfill that purpose. I knew one's personal journey in life, Mr. Speaker, and true individual success is not measured by others. Aim not to be better than others, but just be better than yourself. Better than you were yesterday, Mr. Speaker, and the rest will take care of itself. Live for something bigger than yourself. Change things for the good. Make people's lives better by your presence and your participation in their lives. And finally, Mr. Speaker, my mother, Sharon Roll, my father, Don Cartwright, an engineer at the Broadcasting Corporation of the Bahamas for more than 30 years, and my other father, Mr. H.L. Roll, former police officer and now a businessman, who's been in my life from I was 6 years old, nurtured in me that you must stand up and be courageous. My father, both of my fathers, would often say, just be a man, son, be a man. Mr. Speaker, there are other words you can use for courage. You can say brave, but at this point, Mr. Speaker, no post-election endorsements are needed, all right? So I won't use that word today. Mr. Speaker, I often say that courage is the tool of change, and it is the currency by which we will acquire our legacies and entrench our contributions in this honorable house. The timid souls, Mr. Speaker, leave no indelible mark in Bahamian history other than a reminder to future generations that there were those that were champions of the status quo, who cowered when the Bahamian people demanded change and the Commonwealth of the Bahamas needed it. Mr. Speaker, in my contribution 2 weeks ago, I asked the question, will we be relegated to the unfortunate category of those that left our courage on the steps of this honorable house? Or will this session be remembered for the valor of its members that did not shrink at the challenges we face as a country and did right by the Bahamian people? Mr. Speaker, every day in this honorable house for me is a humbling and proud day. But today, Mr. Speaker, as I stand here, that pride is magnified. This bill, which provides for the establishment of the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions, has evaded many sessions of this Parliament. And as a result, equity and justice, Mr. Speaker, in certain instances, has been equally evasive. That day, Mr. Speaker, has come to an end. Mr. Speaker, I salute our government for tabling this historic piece of legislation. I commend the Honorable Member for Kalani, the Honorable Prime Minister, yes, for his vision, but most of all, his fortitude and steadfastness in keeping his word to the Bahamian people. Mr. Speaker, the Bahamian people demanded it, and we have given it to them. Mr. Speaker, this is what change looks like. Mr. Speaker, although the campaign is over, there are no more appropriate words in this instance than to say that it is the people's time. Justice, in many ways, Mr. Speaker, is the absence of fear. The fear of never having enough, the fear of not being able to keep your family safe, and the fear of living in a less than fair society. Through this bill, Mr. Speaker, the fabric of justice in the Commonwealth of the Bahamas is getting a much-needed alteration. Mr. Speaker, as a people, we cannot lay claim to having a real just society if we allow the proliferation of sanctuaries of legal gray areas where injustice finds safe harbor. There must be continuous efforts to carve out new avenues and new roads through which our legal system can access justice. For far too long, and particularly in recent times, the Bahamian people have watched, in their own view, the apparent conflicts between decisions of the Office of the Attorney General, and more particularly, Mr. Speaker, those that have occupied that office, play out in plain view. Once enacted, this bill will give all powers relating to criminal prosecutions to the Director of Public Prosecutions. No longer will the office holder charged with the prosecution of criminal matters sit in the Cabinet of the Bahamas. The Director of Public Prosecutions will be a custodian of the public interest and the rule of law. There will be no refuge, no shelter for wrongdoing, even within the hierarchy of government. As such, Mr. Speaker, If in the interest of justice, the office of the Director of Public Prosecutions is led to an individual in the cabinet of the Bahamas, the common phrase applies, let the chips fall where they may. Mr. Speaker, the real talk is this. Many Bahamians have felt for a long time that the hands of justice in the Commonwealth of the Bahamas has predominantly reached into pockets of the inner city communities, neglecting too often to aggressively pursue those that have been protected by rank and fortune. This bill, Mr. Speaker, I believe, will eliminate those occurrences. Mr. Speaker, no bill will have an answer to every eventuality. No bill is perfect. As a government, we did not promise, Mr. Speaker, as a government, we did not promise the Bahamian people perfection. We promised them progress. And this is progress, Mr. Speaker. This bill presents a quantum leap from what presently exists in our judicial system. And indeed, the Commonwealth of the Bahamas will be better because of it. Mr. Speaker, I've heard the members opposite in their continuous desire to have distance from the government and be the party of no on all and everything, suggest that this bill doesn't go far enough and that the status quo remains. Mr. Speaker, something tells me that had this bill not been tabled in this honorable House, the members opposite would be ferociously agitating for the establishment of the office of the Director of Public Prosecution as promised to the people of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. Mr. Speaker, all of us will be called upon throughout this session in various moments to either choose party politics or progress for the Bahamian people. Mr. Speaker, I choose progress and I support this bill. May God bless the people of the great constituency of St. Barnabas, and may He continue to richly bless the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
As many? The chair recognizes the honorable member for Fox Hill.
Mr. Speaker, I am once again privileged and honored to rise in this venerable House on behalf of the good people of the great constituency of Fox Hill, New Providence, Bahamas. Mr. Speaker, allow me, before I get into the details of my contribution, to add to the member of St. Barnabas my condolences to the family of Calvin Johnson. He was, as they say, a good man, and may his soul rest in peace. I'd also like to congratulate in Fox Hill two MCMs, meritorious council members, in the personages of Mr. James Jim Curry. I hope you're listening, sir. And Mr. Ronnie Brista for their stellar and unmatched contribution to this party. I'd also like to take this opportunity to congratulate the member opposite, though I don't know how to do that because I'm sitting opposite too, but the Honorable Member for Cat Island on his ascension to the leadership of the Progressive Liberal Party, and as Her Majesty's loyal leader of the opposition, and to the Honorable Member for Exuma and Ragged Island for his elevation to Deputy Leader. It doesn't mean that you have to wait forever. You're a meteor. You're rising fast.
One more hope to go.
Very bad. Very bad. Ain't long now.
And in her absence, I would also like to commend and congratulate the member for Angliston for a bold and courageous move. I think she's struck a blow for women, and I would like to see more women take part in leadership as our country develops. Mr. Speaker, we are here to do the people's business. We are here to fulfill our covenant, our commitment, our duty to the Bahamian people. This bill provides for an independent director of public prosecution. It is one of the deliverables we promised the Bahamian people. So, we are here to deliver, Mr. Speaker. We are here to do the people's business. Mr. Speaker, this is no play government. And for those who delude themselves with such false comfort, it is time to wake up and smell the coffee, for indeed it is the people's time. Mr. Speaker, because I believe that it is in the best interest of the Bahamian people, Fox Hill supports this bill to provide for an independent director of public prosecutions. This bill is a long time in coming, Mr. Speaker. Given that this honorable House, over many decades, has been populated mainly by those in the legal profession, one would have reasonably thought that this bill would have been enacted many years ago. Still, better now than much later. Mr. Speaker, I believe that this bill meets the crucial requirements necessary to jumpstart a process that can lend itself to essential and urgent imperatives that can benefit our judicial system and start a journey on the road to judicial reform. Mr. Speaker, the best way that I can describe what I believe to be the vast potential of this bill is to say that it has the ability to be the enema that can unblock the constipation that has clogged our judicial system for decades. The system, one might say, is reminiscent of a Dickensian chancery court, where matters can go on for years without resolution. A case in point, Mr. Speaker, was that of Mr. Atane Tokikota, a Japanese man who was imprisoned here in the Bahamas for some 8 years without the benefit of due process. Mr. Speaker, in some cases, the parties to the matter die whilst waiting for their day in court, and in other cases, witnesses' memories become faded and unreliable. It, in effect, interrupts the natural flow of life and living as it did in the case of Mr. Atane Tokikota. The ruling by the Bahamas Court of Appeals said in part, during the whole time that he was detained, the appellant was never charged with criminal offense, not even the minor crime of vagrancy or attempted damage to property, nor was he ever charged with the summary offense of illegal landing, contrary to section 19(2) of the Act, end quote. The appellate court went on to say, and I quote, the appellant was not taken before any court until he applied for habeas corpus in 2000, end quote. Mr. Speaker, many of my honorable colleagues have spoken to how much independence the independent director of public prosecutions will have. Most of it has already been said. I will speak to the specific benefits that I believe can accrue to the Bahamian people from the enactment of this bill and the human cost of failing to enact this bill. Mr. Speaker, I am hopeful that an independent director of public prosecutions will see this as an opportunity to do something different, to do something that will positively impact the lives of the Bahamian people and any person who lives among us or visits our shores. I am hopeful that the Office of an Independent Director of Public Prosecution will know that it can be more nimble, that it will, in fact, be more nimble. Mr. Speaker, I am hopeful that the Office of the Independent Director of Public Prosecutions will know that it does not have to do things as they have always been done, and will, in fact, be brave enough and courageous enough to do things as they have not always been done. Mr. Speaker, I am hopeful that energetic and bright young lawyers with strong work ethics will be drawn to the Office of the Independent Director of Public Prosecutions like moths to a flame. I hope this will be so, because they will know that it is an office where things happen and where people's lives matter, where the rule of law matter, and where they can build enviable resumes of strong and positive achievements. Mr. Speaker, similar to the intense competition in the United States, where top law school graduates compete to be clerks to justices of the United States Supreme Court, and where the brightest and the best make the cut, I am hopeful that the Bahamian law graduates will compete equally hard for a space in the Office of an Independent Director of Public Prosecutions, because they will know that by helping their country, they are helping themselves by building great professional reputations of achieving results. Mr. Speaker, oftentimes the sheer enormity of a task can sometimes bring about paralysis. One wonders where to start. How can one make a dent in the huge backlog of cases and outstanding warrants? And how can one jump off the treadmill that goes nowhere? Mr. Speaker, in the governing party, Mr. Speaker, we in the governing party have styled ourselves the change team during the run-up to the general election campaign. This important landmark legislation is in keeping with the conscious decision to change systems, laws, policies, such that their impact on the lives of everyday Bahamians is meaningful in positive and beneficial ways. Mr. Speaker, there is no doubt that an independent director of public prosecutions is an imperative. We cannot do otherwise. We cannot continue to talk about the march towards first world status if our entire judicial system is not part of that conversation and a part of the transformative change to get us there. And so whilst I accept that the independent director of public prosecution is an imperative, we must take a step further, because the administration of justice generally will not work unless the rest of the issues facing the administration of justice are also dealt with comprehensively and at the same time. Mr. Speaker, hundreds of people hang around the courts day after day, week after week, month after month, and yes, Mr. Speaker, even year after year, and their matters still are not resolved for one reason or another. This interrupts commerce, it interrupts family life, it interrupts jobs. It breeds hopelessness and despair, and it robs people of their belief in the very system that were designed to give them a voice and advocacy. I know this, Mr. Speaker, because some of my constituents in Foxville have told me their stories, often with tears behind their eyes and the plaintive notes of bleak hopelessness in their voices. And so, Mr. Speaker, to my mind, whilst the establishment of an Office of an Independent Director of Public Prosecution is a giant step forward, it will only be that step forward unless some additional transformative steps are also taken at the same time. Sometimes, Mr. Speaker, It takes someone removed from a particular profession, someone who's not stymied by the reasons of institutional knowledge or why things cannot be done, but someone who is encouraged and driven by the reasons why things must be done to look at a situation from another perspective. Mr. Speaker, that is why the little boy in the well-known Hans Christian Andersen fable was able to say, "The emperor has no clothes on." Mr. Speaker, in advance, I ask you to forgive my naivety as I embark on this portion of my contribution. I speak from a non-legal perspective. I speak from the perspective of a listener to my constituents in Sportsville. I speak from the stories of their legal struggles. I speak from their feeling that there is nowhere to turn. Mr. Speaker, I am their voice in this honorable place. And so, Mr. Speaker, from my outsider perspective, I believe that the passage of this bill can be the engine that drives true legal reform. I believe that the implementation of two bold initiatives will make this bill, in its application, more transformative in the lives of our citizens and thus the life of our country. First, better salaries and benefits for Supreme Court judges and magistrates. And two, the creation of a lower level magistracy that deals with only minor offenses. So, in effect, two levels of the magistrates' court. Mr. Speaker, we may not even begin to know the enormous potential of this bill to truly change the course of our legal system. Earlier this month, I listened with tears threatening behind my eyes as one of my constituents told her story on ZNS. She spoke about how her son was murdered on the 27th of December 2013. She spoke about her wait for justice, her wait for closure. She spoke about how she had to relive those unspeakable moments again and again when her case was called up and then reset for a future date. How long, Mr. Speaker? How long are we to live this way? How long are we to subject our people, our brothers, our sisters, our mothers, fathers, aunts, uncles, and cousins, the whole extended family, to these types of treatments? I see her eyes grow glassy and misty as she encounters situations that remind her of an unfinished tragedy. And Mr. Speaker, I thank Frank Edgecombe, who during my time at Sandlands Primary School, and Ms. Snowball, who during my time at St. Anne's High School awakened in me a love for classical literature. Because when I think of one constituent having to relive the death of a son again and again, when I think of another constituent who's been trying to have a land matter settled for more than 5 years, when I think of the police bus that speeds through our streets taking people to court only to take them right back to remand, and when I think of Alain Tokitota, I immediately am transported to Charles Dickinson's Bleak House, and I quote, "This is the High Court of Chancery, which gives to moneyed might the means abundantly of wearing out the right, which so exhausts finances, patience, courage, hope, so overcomes the brains and breaks the heart that there is not an honorable man among its practitioners who would not give, but who does not give warning, suffer any wrong that can be done rather than come here." Mr. Speaker, let this not be said of us. We are smart enough, we are resourceful enough, and we have the political will to ensure that this will not be said of us. Still, Mr. Speaker, I am elated, excited, I am overjoyed, because from my vantage point, I see possibilities. I see in the enactment of this bill, coupled with the two important issues I have just outlined, a truly swift justice and judicial reform. I see the possibility to not just think outside of the box. I see the possibility to get out of the box. Senator Robert F. Kennedy used the variation of a George Bernard Shaw quotation as the theme of his 1968 campaign for the presidential nomination. Some men see things as they are and say, why? I dream things that never were and say, why not? Swift justice was a slogan that captured the imagination of a hopeful people. They saw it as the tonic for their legal woes. However, today, we are still mired in backlogged cases that appear to have little chance of seeing sunlight. Mr. Speaker, this bill is a fantastic opportunity to make that bold step where we have not trod before. If we do not, then the office of an independent director of public prosecutions will fare no better than the current status quo and will be abysmally inefficient as well. Mr. Speaker, better salaries and benefits for Supreme Court judges and magistrates have the power to attract some of the brightest and the best legal minds to the bench. Performance, efficiency, and the delivery of judicial services can be benchmarked against objective criteria. This will have the desired effect of causing the criminal and civil bar to be more efficient in the delivery and provision of legal services to the public. In this way, the administration of justice can become an industry of excellence that the best and the brightest aspire to be a part of. It can develop legitimacy, respectability, and dignity by proudly providing justice across the board in criminal prosecution, legal aid, and criminal defense, personal injuries, fatal accidents, matrimonial matters, real estate matters, maritime industry, dispute resolution, mediation, and negotiation. Mr. Speaker, I am so excited about the possibilities that I am tempted to ask you to close your eyes and imagine it. But somehow, I think that it is not appropriate to do so. Therefore, I will simply just ask you to imagine it. Mr. Speaker, the transformational opportunity is the creation of a lower level magistracy such that the two levels of the magistracy can deal with simple matters that clog up the system. Successful variations of this are found in several Commonwealth countries, including Australia, South Africa, England, and Wales. Mr. Speaker, the creation of this two-tier system below the Supreme Court, where magistrates have some tenure and independence and are lawyers of a caliber who can deal with serious offenses which carry prison terms of 2 to 7 years and which have a jury of perhaps 6 people, we would revolutionize the administration of justice so that the minor matters are dealt with by entry-level magistrates. More serious matters would be dealt with by a second-tier stipendary and circuit magistrates, and the third tier, the more serious offenses, carrying custodial sentences of more than 7 years by the full Supreme Court. Mr. Speaker, if we go boldly where no Bahamian government has gone before, then we can truly have an independent director of public prosecution and can make a real, a sustainable, and beneficial contribution to our country. Foxhill supports this bill. Foxhill supports this bill. Thank you.
As many? The chair recognizes the honorable member for Mount Moriah. Honorable member, just before you begin, I wish to bring to the attention of honorable members that the observance of Remembrance Day will occur on the 12th of November. The service will be held at Christ Church Cathedral beginning at 11 a.m. And the service for the laying of wreaths will follow at 12:15 p.m. We urge all members who are able to attend the service in remembrance of those who have given their lives to the development of our nation. The chair recognizes the honorable member for Mount Moriah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, before I begin my contribution, I would like to offer my condolences to the family of a friend, a brother, and a former member of this honorable house, the late Calvin Johnson, on his passing. Calvin has made his contribution. His journey is complete. May his soul rest in peace. Like the honorable member from Fox Hill, I would also like to pay special mention to the MCMs of my constituency, Mr. Bennett Minnis, Mr. Alsworth Munnings, and Ms. Melvern Wong, who were also recognized for their unselfish commitment to party as well as country on Saturday past. Mr. Speaker, sticking with my constituency, I would also like to send a special congratulations to Mr. Jason Fitzgerald and the executive members of the Millennium Gardens Association, who recently held their association meeting, and they were elected during a special election. We'll also like to recognize the FNM Mount Moriah Association and their executives for a very, very successful, recently held election. And so congratulations to them. Mr. Speaker, I also offer my congratulations to the honorable members from Cat Island and San Salvador, Exuma and Ragged Island, and South and Central Andros for their elevation to the highest office in their party. I will conclude by saying this to the honorable member for Angliston in her absence, my cousin, that the deck was stacked against her, and I know she may be listening to this, but don't dismay. You're an Auckland's woman, Hannah Tynes and hasty blood. You're strong. Press on. You will eventually find your silver lining.
Hopefully on this side.
Hopefully on this side. Mr. Speaker, I rise in this honorable place because of the good people of the great constituency of Mount Moriah, whom I represent and have the honor to serve. I thank them for their confidence in me, and without question, I thank God for enabling me to serve. The bill before us is an act to amend Article 78 of the Constitution to provide for the establishment of the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions. The crux of these proposed constitutional amendments is to eliminate all political interference within our criminal justice system. Mr. Speaker, the fact is there has been an entrenched belief that once one assumes high office, he or she is above the law and is not subject to the very laws that they are responsible for creating. I am here today, Mr. Speaker, on behalf of my government, my leader, to sound the alarm and to let the message ring out loud and clear that those days are no more. Mr. Speaker, as politicians, we are not above the law, and so I say to those of my colleagues in this honorable House, don't get caught up. Don't get sidetracked. Because there is no longer a political lifeline for you, or so that you can call to get a get-out-of-jail-free card. Yes, there were quite a number of persons of privilege who may have benefited from the lawless behavior in the past, but those days are gone. Not under a Hubert Minnis-led government. We are now in the people's time, and the people's time is now. Mr. Speaker, because it is the people's time, we, the servants of the people, elected by the people, in a resounding fashion, are repealing and replacing Article 78, which will position the Attorney General as the principal legal advisor to the government, and no longer the decision maker responsible for criminal prosecutions. This means that, therefore, political cronies will no longer be able to call their politician friends and seek to dictate or influence the outcome of any investigations or any criminal matter before the courts. Mr. Speaker, consequently, Article 78A, which creates the Office of Director of Public Prosecutions, will now give full autonomy to the Director. The creation of this independent Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions will confer all powers relating to criminal prosecutions, previously vested in the Attorney General, to the Director of Public Prosecutions. Therefore, law enforcement officers need not concern themselves anymore in carrying out their duties to investigate, arrest, and charge public officials, including members of the government, if warranted. If the evidence is there, then don't despair. Do your jobs. The buck stops at the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions. Mr. Speaker, make no mistake, these proposed amendments demonstrate a bold and mature approach by our government to devolve power to public officials in a responsible manner. We only see bills like this when a society is moving towards a greater level of maturity and accountability. If we are moving towards a mature society, then it means that the era of poor decision-making and poor governance becomes a thing of the past. This administration, Mr. Speaker, is resolute about fulfilling its mandate of service, devolving power in the hands of the people of this great nation, the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. That we call our home. Mr. Speaker, what has existed for years is an Attorney General who is a politician and one who sets legislative policies. Further, our penal code is replete with offenses that cannot begin without the authorization of the Attorney General, and criminal cases that can be abruptly ended by the Attorney General just by the stroke of a pen. In recent times, noli prosequi, made famous by the last administration due to its frequent usage in select matters, has become commonplace in our Bahamian lexicon. This is unfair to police officers and prosecutors who have invested a tremendous amount of time and man hours, in some cases at great risk to themselves, to bring criminals to justice. Mr. Speaker, the former Attorney General is reported to have said that she thinks it is unnecessary for the authority to be issued a noli prosequi, to be transferred to the Director of Public Prosecutions, as the Attorney General is in usual course acts upon the advice of his or her advisors. The former Attorney General, in the May 26, 2017 edition of the Nassau Guardian, said, and I quote, "And, in fact, I can say, without fear of contradiction, that all of the nullies that I have signed came upon the advice, ultimately, of the DPPs," unquote. Taking advice does not necessarily mean that you will follow that advice. So let's eliminate the AG's role as the decision maker in criminal prosecution one time. Mr. Speaker, what is important is that the very appearance of political interference in the prosecutorial process needs to be removed, and the amendment makes it abundantly clear that the DPP, in his or her own right or authority, will determine whether or not to proceed with the prosecution of an individual. These proposed amendments will send a clear message that this administration is desirous of not only upholding the integrity of the criminal justice system, but ensuring that the appearance of political misconduct, especially when politically sensitive matters arise, are avoided with all powers conferred to the Director of Public Prosecutions. Mr. Speaker, when we came to office just a few short months ago, the Honorable Member for Kalani, our Prime Minister, Dr. Hubert Minnis, emphatically ushered in a new era of transparency and accountability, signaling a true start to the people's time from the people's government. Mr. Speaker, these constitutional amendments prevent the Attorney General from terminating the services of the Director of Public Prosecutions and allow the Director to bring any politician, including the holder of the highest office in our land, before the courts, if warranted, without being subject to political meddling. Thus, the amendment allows for the Director to institute and undertake criminal proceedings against any person before any court in respect of any offense against the laws of the Bahamas. Mr. Speaker, independent prosecutorial directors are nothing new to the region. Small island states like Antigua, Barbados, Bermuda, Jamaica, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Vincent, and the Grenadines, among others, all have established offices for directors of public prosecutions. Only 5 years ago, our closest neighbor to the south of us, our little sister, the Turks and Caicos Island, also created the Office of Public Prosecution. With an amendment to its constitution in 2011, and the office being realized in 2012. We lag behind our Caribbean counterparts in modernizing the halls of justice to deliver fairness across the board. That is, until now. This administration, led by our visionary leader, Prime Minister Dr. Hubert Minnis, understands that any interference in the judicial system impedes growth and forward mobility in any discipline. Mr. Speaker, our administration realizes that these amendments will put to an end the catchy phrase like swift justice, where political inputs determine the fate of individuals traversing the criminal justice system. Therefore, equities of accountability and trust are engendered in these amendments and are the trademarks of the people's government. Mr. Speaker, an independent prosecutorial service will allow for a director who is a servant of the people and one who is constitutionally protected and free from political interference. Notwithstanding, an independent director of public prosecutions will boost public trust and confidence in the Bahamas criminal justice system. Mr. Speaker, this bill provides a framework to limit unbridled power by government. The director may be terminated only if he or she is unable to perform the duties of the office, whether arising from physical or mental incapacity or for misconduct. If an investigation is opened due to the inability to perform duties, the Prime Minister presents the matter to the Governor General, who in turn appoints a tribunal acting in accordance with the advice of the Judicial and Legal Services Commission. The office of the director shall not be abolished while there is a substantive holder thereof. Mr. Speaker, the Bahamian people must always be confident in the way the top prosecutor handles the legal affairs of our land. Mr. Speaker, I now turn to the specific amendments and I raise them in the context of the existing Act. Clause 3 of this bill allows for the establishment of tenure of the Office of Director of Public Prosecutions. It also provides for criminal legal proceedings for and against the state to be taken in the name of the Director of Public Prosecutions. Further, this article provides for the Attorney General in cases involving considerations of public policy, national security, or international obligation of the Bahamas to give general or specific directions to the director as to exercise of the powers conferred on such director. Mr. Speaker, while matters of national security still rest in the ambit of the government, as it should, even in situations where required, the Attorney General has to place in writing his directives, and so the Attorney General is on the limb if something is amiss and becomes fully accountable to the people of this nation. So this, Mr. Speaker, is what this government refers to when we say that it is our intention to be transparent, to be open, to be accountable. This, Mr. Speaker, is evidence of a government of maturity. Mr. Speaker, this requirement in writing...
Honorable member, technical intervention. All members, can you please raise your microphone? It appears as if a microphone is on. So if you can just raise your mic. Just raise all of them for me, please. Thank you, honorable member. You may continue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this requirement in writing from the Attorney General to the Director of Public Prosecution that this amendment provides has to be gazetted, meaning it will instantaneously be published for all to see. As a result, the Bahamian people will immediately be informed through the media or of the specific directive, such as terms and rationale given by the Attorney General. This prerequisite, again, demonstrates that ours is a government of transparency and accountability. This amendment directly follows the provisions of the law of Canada, which will be a first for our region. So, Mr. Speaker, we're not only a government of transparency, accountability, and maturity, we're also a pioneering government. And we are demonstrating it through the bills that we intend to bring before this honorable House. Mr. Speaker, Clause 4 seeks to provide a transitional provisions and allows for criminal proceedings to which the Attorney General is party and are ongoing on the day on which the act comes into force, to be continued by the director. Whoever serves as director will remain in the position for 5 years and may be appointed to further serve for a period not to exceed 5 years. Mr. Speaker, this administration is determined to meet the prosecutorial needs of the 21st century. We are resolute in bringing about change and delivering fair and objective judgment. These proposed amendments to the establishment of an independent office of Director of Public Prosecutions will play a key role in the administration of justice in our nation. This is only the beginning. To use a Junkanoo vernacular, we coming. Many more transformative bills are on its way. The people of this great nation will begin to feel a part of the fabric of this nation, as they should, as if they truly have a stake in determining what matters or matters relating to their self-interest and the interests of our country. This is the first in a series of bills that really speak to the government's dictum of transferring the power to prosecute and to govern in the hands of the people. Mr. Speaker, what will determine our fate is transparency and trust. We all have a collective role in the governance of our nation, and a bill such as this will move us in the right direction. Mr. Speaker, Mount Moriah supports this bill for an act to amend the Constitution to provide for the establishment of the Office of Director of Public Prosecution for matters connected thereto. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
As many, the chair recognizes the honorable member for Seabreeze.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise on behalf of the great constituents of Seabreeze to support this bill, the Constitutional Amendment Bill, Mr. Speaker, to create or establish the office of an independent Director of Public Prosecutions and for matters related or connected thereto. Mr. Speaker, I would like to begin this contribution by giving my thanks to the Almighty God for this opportunity once again to sit and now to stand in this place to serve the Bahamian people, to serve my country, and to do that which is right. Mr. Speaker, I want to also publicly state that I'm thankful to my family for allowing me to pursue this journey of service to country And indeed, Mr. Speaker, I thank the good member of Kalani, our Honorable Prime Minister, for reposing confidence in me to be able to serve as a part of his cabinet. Mr. Speaker, the people of Seabreeze are happy, and the people of Seabreeze are grateful that we now have a government that is by the people and for the people and with the people. Mr. Speaker, they say that a building is only as strong as its foundation. And today, what we have here in this debate is a strong foundation. Mr. Speaker, we are beginning our debates with a Constitution Amendment Bill. We are standing on our supreme law that governs all other laws. And Mr. Speaker, we are starting off, I say, the right place, the right time, and to do the right thing. Mr. Speaker, and just in case sometimes persons believe that we are speaking off of air, I want to make it clear that we're speaking in substance. The Constitution is real and it is a living document. Mr. Speaker, Article 52(1) of this Constitution indicates that Parliament may make laws for the peace, order, and good governance of its people. Mr. Speaker, that is the foundation upon which this pre-national movement government is standing, and therefore, Mr. Speaker, it is indeed my privilege to stand here as the member for Seabreeze to support this strong foundation that has been laid before and that we are continuing to build upon. Mr. Speaker, I say that we are starting at the right place, we are starting at the right time, and we are doing the right thing. Mr. Speaker, I want to, before I go a little further into the debate, to congratulate 87 students who would have graduated with their general equivalency diploma through the Urban Renewal Program as a result of a joint effort between the Urban Renewal Commission and the Atlantic College. Mr. Speaker, students, adults who would not otherwise have had the opportunity or chance to complete their high school graduation or certificate had that opportunity, a year-long course, Mr. Speaker, and those individuals, some 50, age 50, some age 40, age 30, Mr. Speaker, they stuck with it. And so I told them on last week, Sunday, the 24th of October, year of our Lord 2017, and many of them in tears to see that where they came from and now to realize under this government where they're going, that they're going somewhere. They have a government that they can feel and you know, results that they can touch, and now jobs that they can ascertain to take care of their families. And so I ended by saying to them, Mr. Speaker, they've made the right choice to start it, they've made the right choice to stick with it, and they have made the right choice to finish it. Mr. Speaker, I congratulate them. Mr. Speaker, I further wish to congratulate 13 senior citizens, age 80 and older. I had the opportunity as the Minister for Social Services and Urban Development to deliver the keynote address in the presence of Her Excellency Dame Marguerite Pinling on Monday past. Mr. Speaker, those individuals, we call them our nation builders. Mr. Speaker, they have worked throughout the communities, and can you believe, Mr. Speaker, we had a gentleman there, 94 years of age, standing and walking and hearing and talking. Mr. Speaker, I was elated to have the opportunity to be able to stand on their shoulders and to stand with them and say, we are grateful for what you have done for this country. Mr. Speaker, I want to congratulate them. They came from Centerville, they came from Fort Charlotte, they came from all over, Mr. Speaker, and they have done a great job in building our nation. They are our nation builders, and International Older Persons Day, we celebrate internationally under the United Nations, and Mr. Speaker, we join with them in recognizing those individuals, and for their service, we say thank you. I said to them in closing, Mr. Speaker, that life is not, I quoted as a matter of fact Maya Angelou, the American poet, who said that life is not measured by the moments of breath we take, but by the moments that take our breath. And indeed, they took my breath away. Mr. Speaker, I also want to congratulate the meritorious council members of the Free National Movement. They were honored, many of them, this past Saturday during a gala banquet, Mr. Speaker, at the Atlantis Hotel. And, you know, I'm just proud to be a part of the Free National Movement. And, you know, when we do things, we do it in grand style. And so the house was packed, and, you know, the Honorable Prime Minister was there and his beautiful wife. And I'm telling you, everybody just had a wonderful time, you know. You know, so, you know, and the tickets were available to all. You know, everyone could have come and supported each other. Can't we all, Mr. Speaker, just get along? But, Mr. Speaker, I want to congratulate those meritorious council members. Those were individuals, Mr. Speaker, that demonstrated over the years loyalty in our good and our bad. We had formerly 3 non-consecutive terms in office as a government, and those individuals, whether we were in or out of government, they would have stuck with the party, and I think that it was fitting to honor them. And Mr. Speaker, it simply speaks to the quality of leadership that we have today and that our party has grown. And so, Mr. Speaker, I congratulate them. Mr. Speaker, particularly Mr. Alvy Penn, MCM, Ms. Irma Williams, our MCM, Mr. Oswald Munnings, and all of them, we want to say, and I want to congratulate, Mr. Speaker, and it would be remiss of me not to do so, the honorable member for Cat Island, Rumpke, and San Salvador on his win as the leader of the Progressive Liberal Party. It's been a long time coming, you know, but he stuck it out and he stuck with it.
It's yours. It's yours.
And now it's his.
Free at last.
And so, Mr. Speaker, honor is due to him, and so I say congratulations also to the newly appointed and elected deputy leader, the good member for Exuma and Rugged Island. You know, congratulations to you as well, sir. And then to the new leader of business, the good member for South and Central Andros, I would like to extend also my congratulations at this time. Mr. Speaker, again, it would be remiss of me not to acknowledge the sole female in the opposition. Mr. Speaker, even in her absence, Mr. Speaker, having been recently elected the chairman of the Commonwealth Women Parliamentarians Association in the Americas and the Atlantic Bahamas branch, and I am her predecessor. And so, Mr. Speaker, I want to say to her to continue keeping on, and just to say a little preach word which says, nobody told you that the road would be easy, but I don't believe that the good Lord would have brought her this far to leave her now. Mr. Speaker, I move on now to say that the Greek philosopher Socrates would have said in his time many, many years ago, if leaders are good, Mr. Speaker, the people will be good. And so, Mr. Speaker, what we have today in this debate is simply indicative of good leadership. Mr. Speaker. That is all that is happening here today. And when you have good leadership, you start from the foundation and you build thereupon, and then you have a strong house and a strong city. And that's all it is, Mr. Speaker. And so we're starting off here, the right place, the right time, and simply doing the right thing. We're acting responsibly, Mr. Speaker, and we're here to keep our promise of ensuring transparency and accountability. We made a promise. Mr. Speaker, our manifesto, again, it's here and it's online. Mr. Speaker, we don't hide and we don't make these what did they have last time? No, a very large book, over 100 pages. I was trying to read it and I could not seem to find anything that was, any promise that was kept. It was a document that the Progressive Liberal Party would have had last time. Right now it's out of my mind, but they had a big book. It was a big book of prophet promises. And, you know, but simply, Mr. Speaker, the people, it was a book that the people did not believe in and did not trust, and it went nowhere and it did nothing. But, Mr. Speaker, we have a document the people can trust, and so we are here to keep that promise. I believe they're about on page 41 in terms of our reform or judicial reform, we indicated, Mr. Speaker, that we want to ensure that people's cases are expedited and prosecuted in a timely fashion. We are here to live up to that promise. We gave our word, Mr. Speaker. We're here to keep our word. We made a promise, and we're here to honor that promise. That's it, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we said in our introduction, in our manifesto, that we are committed to the principles of good governance, to accountability, to transparency, and to participation. I maintain, Mr. Speaker, that we were not elected by happenstance. I'm just one of them far out. I believe that people elected us because they know, as I would have known from age 16 watching the Free National Movement, that the caliber of people of that particular party, this particular party, is a government wherein you will see sunshine. The last 5 years, Mr. Speaker, was simply to many a nightmare. It was filled with dark days, and Mr. Speaker, but it seemed hopeless.
Had to go on WhatsApp.
But Mr. Speaker, I always said to persons, I know a God somewhere, and I am thankful that he did not sleep and he did not slumber. And the Bahamian people stuck with us, and we stuck with them, and so they know. So it's not by happenstance, and it is not because they did not want the other side. They knew exactly what they wanted, and they wanted leaders they can trust. That's the reputation of the Free National Movement government. They wanted servants that will deliver. That's what the people wanted. Mr. Speaker, I can speak for the people because I am one of them. We wanted a party that will provide a clear choice and good alternative. And Mr. Speaker, the Free National Movement has always been that type of government or group of individuals to be there to ensure people have an alternative to government. And that is what we did, Mr. Speaker, a government for all the people. Now let me say one moment, Mr. Speaker, again what I like about this government, it is not a government only for the poor. It is not a government only for the rich or for the middle or upper class or lower class. And it is not a government merely for one color over the other. What I like about this government, it is a government for all.
Oh, yeah.
Mr. Speaker, page 41 of the manifesto, it says, we realize the proper and efficient functioning of the judiciary is important to fight against crime and ensure aggrieved parties receive justice within a reasonable period. Mr. Speaker, we have leadership that is, I told you from on the campaign trail, I said focused and calculated. Mr. Speaker, and if you don't do your homework, you will not pass the test. Mr. Speaker, that public relations campaign about swift justice, I didn't buy it as an attorney then, and I still don't buy it now, and I don't think anybody ever bought it.
Was it Swift? Wasn't Swift?
Mr. Speaker, if we are to say that ensuring that persons cannot receive an opportunity for a bail hearing before the actual magistrate who would have heard them immediately or who would have heard their case initially, if that is swift justice, to quickly put that person and remand them to Foxhill without an opportunity to have bail or have an opportunity to be heard substantively on the matter before that magistrate, Mr. Speaker, then I really don't agree with it. That was not swift justice in my view, Mr. Speaker. And for many individuals, when I sat as a member of the bar and at other place, Mr. Speaker, persons, because they could not get bail right before the magistrate, many of them had to plead guilty, Mr. Speaker, just to be able to go home to their families. And I'm not talking about murder cases. I'm talking about minor cases, Mr. Speaker. They had to plead guilty just to go home with their families. And I watched fathers and sons who would have had a little bickering and sisters had a little bickering. The other had to go outside, and we better agree to this, because the magistrate cannot grant bail in this particular case, Mr. Speaker. And so that was Mr. Speaker. And so if we want to call getting convictions on that premise swift justice, Mr. Speaker, that is a swift justice the people did not want. the people did not believe in, and the people made sure got rid of. Mr. Speaker, we are here, Mr. Speaker, to do what is right by the people. The mischief is the problem. We are creating laws for good order and governance of the people. So what are we trying to achieve, Mr. Speaker, by this Constitution Amendment Bill for an Act to establish the Independent Director of Public Prosecutions? What are we trying to do, Mr. Speaker? We are trying to simply restore good government. That's all, Mr. Speaker. Apparently, the people voted out the last government because they were not convinced that all the things they were doing or proclaiming to do was good governance. We disagreed. We disagreed. We disagreed. We disagree then. We disagree now. And as I am one of those, I don't know if I will ever agree with that other side. Mr. Speaker, and so we are here to restore good government. Mr. Speaker, so what is the mischief we're trying to accomplish by producing this bill? And I say this, Mr. Speaker, because, you know, many... Mr. Speaker, you know, right before elections, Mr. Speaker, this 2017 elections, I don't know, it was reported about 70 bills were laid on the table and passed. I mean, in days before the election, you know, Mr. Speaker, we are here to produce these bills for legislation to bring about good governance. This is not a game. And about 70 or so bills last minute. You had 5 years to bring all the bills you can bring, Mr. Speaker. Last minute, now we can find about 70 bills. I mean, and want to stay here till midnight. You know, but the people did not buy into it. And so what mischief are we trying to correct? One, Mr. Speaker, the diminution of public confidence. Diminution of public confidence in the Attorney General's office. The confidence in the Attorney General's office has been diminishing, particularly over the last 5 years. And so that is one of the mischief we're trying to capture. Secondly, diminishing of confidence in the independence of the judiciary. Mr. Speaker, that is what we're trying to capture. 3, abuse or appearance of abuse of the doctrine of separation of powers. Again, that is the purpose of this bill. It is not merely to throw on the table. We're not trying to win an election. We've already done that. We're trying to govern. Mr. Speaker, I digress to say that it seemed for the last 5 years that all we were in was some sort of political party or game, or I don't know what was going on. I did not see governance the last 5 years. And so I applaud this government for starting off the right way. We are here to govern. We didn't win the election. And might I say, emphatically so. Mr. Speaker, the 4th mischief we're trying to capture is this: lack of transparency, lack of confidence and accountability in the administration of public prosecution. So, Mr. Speaker, we understand what this bill is trying to do. We're not trying to put on a charade or play a game or win some public relations campaign, everything about the place in blue, gold, and the various colors. Mr. Speaker, I told everyone I was not moved by one color one bit. I am moved by substance and what is going to be done for the betterment of the Bahamian people. I am serious about it. Mr. Speaker, you know, sometimes no matter how much good you do, they call the good evil, and then they call evil good. You know, Mr. Speaker, the people of the Bahamas said they didn't want this, and then they had a government that gave them that. Mr. Speaker, in the referendum, the people spoke, and then we heard some other people and say the people don't know what they're talking about. Mr. Speaker, you will always have persons who want to do their own thing, but this is a good thing. That's what I want to make clear to the Bahamian people, Mr. Speaker. This is a good thing, and it's for the benefit and the betterment of the Bahamian people and for the growth of our country. Mr. Speaker, this bill the aims of this bill, the Director's Office aims to operate to the highest professional standards and to treat all those with whom it comes into contact with fairly, equally, and consistently without any wrongful discrimination. Mr. Speaker, this bill is nothing new. The DPP is the office officially charged with the prosecution of criminal offenses in several criminal jurisdictions around the world. This is nothing new. The title is used mainly in jurisdictions, Mr. Speaker, that are or have been members of the Commonwealth of Nations. Australia had their DPP Act from 1984. Belize had their act from 1974. Canada, Mr. Speaker, from 2006. Norway, South Africa, United Kingdom, Hong Kong, Ireland. Mr. Speaker, we're just trying to catch up, Mr. Speaker. We're trying to catch up. And you know, Mr. Speaker, it'll be disingenuous, to say the least, for anybody to ever disagree that this is not a good thing. This is a good thing, Mr. Speaker, in the right place, at the right time. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, it is an independent prosecuting service and government agency. The director has the highest authority to prosecute criminal offenses. Mr. Speaker, listen to this. In Norway, the director is subordinate to the government cabinet. However, the cabinet has never reversed a decision of the director. This point is very important, Mr. Speaker. But this, Mr. Speaker, can only be maintained with good government. Mr. Speaker, if the Bahamian people miss and blink their eyes and go to sleep on that other side, Mr. Speaker, it'll be problems. And so you need good leadership. I want to say that. It's a caveat. And good government, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that this bill and what it intends to do is actually done. And so we have to state that for the Bahamian people. If you move, you're covering. And some preachers here know, then you're out in the cold. You need your covering, Mr. Speaker, and this government and this leadership, this prime minister, this is a good covering. Mr. Speaker, social services needs a director of public prosecution. Maybe a little touchy, but our child protective services, we have too many cases, Mr. Speaker, in regard to the domestic violence and our child protective services. We have cases, Mr. Speaker, with too many older men and having children with these 15 and 16-year-olds, Mr. Speaker. We want to know safely that these individuals and perpetrators and sexual offenders or proposed or alleged sexual offenders can be prosecuted, no matter who they are and where they are and who their family is, Mr. Speaker. All the people want is a fair opportunity, fair prosecution, a fair system. Mr. Speaker, that's the only way we're going to all get along in this country. Because, Mr. Speaker, when their sister is abused and that abuser is allowed to go unabated, when their brother is abused and that individual, the prosecution is stopped because of who their family is, Mr. Speaker, people are not happy. And when people are not happy, Mr. Speaker, they act out in emotional ways at times. And many, Mr. Speaker, may not be as reasonable as you or I, whereby we may take it, and some of us may even take it in the hands of the good Lord. But as you can see, and as we all know, Mr. Speaker, some people are deciding to take it into their own hands. And so, Mr. Speaker, if they feel that they have a government and a system that they can trust, which they will have in this independent director of public prosecution, you will find their confidence raised. And many of them may, I believe, think twice and even three times before willing to take their matters or making the decision to take matters into their own hands. Mr. Speaker, we need in social services an independent director of public prosecution to speed up these cases, Mr. Speaker, even in the cases of child neglect and abandonment, Mr. Speaker. Some of these parents leaving the children Mr. Speaker, and not caring where they are and what's going on with them, and some of these mothers allowing the children and the young girls to prosecute their bodies. These are things that are happening, Mr. Speaker, and we need an independent director of public prosecution that is going to set his face or her face, Mr. Speaker, like Flint, and say, if you perish, you're going to perish, but you're not going to abuse our children. It doesn't matter what family you come from. It doesn't matter how much money you have. Mr. Speaker, this is why we need this office. Mr. Speaker, this bill is a necessity. Mr. Speaker, it will assist with the speed at which matters can be dispensed with. I say that, Mr. Speaker, because sometimes when a child is abused very early and the matter takes 10 years to come about, they were 10 and now they're 20. Sometimes, Mr. Speaker, the problems we have is they don't want to rehash that. They don't want to relive that incident again. They're trying to put that behind them. And so, Mr. Speaker, there's a problem now with them coming forward to give evidence and for the case to be properly prosecuted. We need this independent director of prosecution to help speed up these cases, Mr. Speaker. And this is a bill in the right direction. It's here at the right time, and we are doing, as a government for the Bahamian people, the right thing. Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, what is the substantive effect of this bill? There are a few, and I will point them out to you briefly. One, Mr. Speaker, this bill will ensure that the public prosecution is fair, the process is transparent, and the rule of law is upheld. That is important, Mr. Speaker. Like someone said earlier, the good member, what is good for the goose is good for the gander. And this bill will ensure that. Number two, the substantive effect of this bill. The integrity of the cabinet will be held or upheld and separation of power maintained. Mr. Speaker, no member of the cabinet will be able to interfere with the decision of a magistrate and then to merely say, I am attempting to help a constituent. Mr. Speaker, the third thing, prosecution rightly brought will be continued to the end. Hence, this bill seeks to correct the mischief wherein cases are discontinued because, Mr. Speaker, files of a former client of sitting members of Parliament cannot be found. I want to say that again. The cases, Mr. Speaker, will be pursued to the end, Mr. Speaker, no matter which government is in, because there is a security of tenure, and, Mr. Speaker, one cannot say the files cannot be found of a sitting Attorney General, Mr. Speaker. And it further seeks to ensure prosecution to the fullest extent of the law brought against an individual, whether or not they are former clients of the Attorney General or otherwise. Mr. Speaker, this bill, in effect, will ensure independence of the judiciary. This is the concept that the judiciary needs to be kept away from the other branches of government, the executive and the legislature. Mr. Speaker, this will ensure elements of independence, security of tenure. It is stated in the bill, security of tenure. The independent director of public prosecution, their office will continue for 5 years, and their office cannot be abolished within that period. That is security of tenure and protection of the independent office. Mr. Speaker, separation of powers, this will ensure the doctrine is upheld. Integrity of prosecutions, Mr. Speaker, public officer, it is a public office. Now this, Mr. Speaker, I like about the bill. The public officer, the independent director of public prosecution is a public officer, which means that this individual themselves will also be subject, if necessary, to scrutiny. Hello, Mr. Speaker? I thought I had an hour. But I'm wrapping it up nevertheless. But that is what was communicated. But, Mr. Speaker, I'll wrap it up, Mr. Speaker. But the integrity of the prosecution will be upheld. And so, Mr. Speaker, because this individual is a public officer, they will also be subject to judicial review, wherein you're able, or the courts are able, to review the process that was used to make a decision and whether that process was ultra-virus the law or intra-virus in the law. And that is important, Mr. Speaker, for persons to have that avenue, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that everyone is above the law. If the Prime Minister can be prosecuted, Mr. Speaker, the DPP better uphold the law as well. Nobody is going to be unto themselves. We all will be subject to the rule of law. Mr. Speaker, as I close, Seabreeze supports this constitutional amendment bill that in the right place not only seeks to do what is right, but it seeks to do the right thing. Mr. Speaker, this bill can positively impact reduction in crime through fair and timely prosecution. The bill can positively impact symptoms of social decay. The bill can positively impact the growth and development of our country and repave the road of a better Bahamas. Mr. Speaker, I end by saying the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is known for his insightful and instructive utterances, and he said, "The time, Mr. Speaker, is always right to do the right thing." Mr. Speaker, Seabreeze stands to support this bill for an act to establish an independent director of public prosecution, because this bill for an act is the right thing to do at the right time, and we're doing it in the right place. Mr. Speaker, I thank you.
As many, the chair recognizes the honorable member for East Grand Bahama. The chair recognizes the honorable member for Bamboo Town.
Mr. Speaker, this is a good place for us to suspend, and I do move at this time that the House do suspend until tomorrow morning, the 2nd of November, Thursday, 2017, at 10 a.m.
Second. It has been moved and second that the business of the House do suspend until 10 a.m. November 2nd. As many as are in favor will remain seated. Those who oppose will rise. The business of this House stands suspended until 10 a.m. Thursday morning, the 2nd of November.